Jeev is Michikamel, hon Harvish Leabharlainne an Kawan, Boal an fáilte allmhór a choróvan seachanacht. Tá ócáid speisial le curtha le céilagin, ag obair le Jonny Dillon, cartlaní le cnúsach Béalóidis éireann sa choláiste ollscoil Baile. Ihe cultúr fehe, can differúil gan dabhs, ach ghlachsas agus éist le Jonny Dillon agus a cólachaí Claire Doohan, ag caint faoin anfadó agus cé cotáhachta atá Béalóidis fós san léniu. We are delighted to host Jonny Dillon for Culture Night 2020. Jonny is an archivist who, with his colleague Claire Doohan, have provided a series of podcasts, Blúiríní Béaloidis, on soundcloud.com, data taken from the National Folklore Collection, University College Dublin. Tonight we provide a special treat for you. Jonny in conversation on the topic of what is folklore. The talk is as Gaeilge initially and then reverts to Béarla. Jonny Dillon and Claire Doohan delving into definitions of folklore to dispel some common misconceptions surrounding this area of interest, as well as tracing the cultural and the political context of the interest in folk tradition. Join them both for a wonderfully warm and engaging hour of discussion as they tease out the functions of folklore, the antidote it offers in a material, post-fact world, and how it continues as a living force. Anish, agus sibh I bhforthaí costealaí, nó fiú sa cá, nóair a mos tróna inniu. Tóir clús éisteachta don agaibh heibhar thairsing seo ina bléitar bunús an Béalóidis, agus an cangel a coithíonn sé idir an duine agus an tíodracht, cultúra, nádúrtha agus hóisialta. Ina bhascain sé, Anish seo Jonny.
An lína leomanis tá an Béalóidis agus an cartlaní ag gnúsach Béalóidis an Jonny Dillon. Tá podchéile nua tosaithe agus se Blúiríní Béaloidis an tanmatá Cad atá gceist le podchéile Béalóidis?
Well, agus séir atá gceist gbonúsach spás an podchéile seo, podchéile míosú tosní aganne an socha gnúsach Béalóidis an glás ollscoil Blachlaí ina dhéanam hénig agus cólachaí agus Harlem Claire Doohan. Íoras gbonúsach léirgus a chuirt síl cultúr the héireann seanachas agus creadúntaí ar séintear agus suppose didimid burt play gné féile an Béalóidis nach an nagrán na chlór so tógamid cinlín topic over féile agus didimid flé agus a chéire so lang didimid joch a chlío cinlín nafir Malta agus spragúil de súrad freisin and trí lasavant as seanna héagsaní sean leabhar me chagan an sa gnúsach lábhscríbhní agus freisin tafid fuma ón gartlan so denim si cinlín íireacht cinlín guilty beag fuma siú an gartlan fuma agan a bhaineann leis na hábhar féile so sin lá gbunúsach ábhar féile téama féile agus mascáin idir seanna leabhraí agus lábhscríbhní agus lehéad an go bhheithí an tólas a chur láthir is slí mar dúirt nafir Malta agus spragú.
Ar cín ar fad agus bheith chanacha dtíine ceapas dochan gur nó nuasmína tú Béalóidis go chaintear neadidir fin scéalta agus beidir pisróga ach an bhfuil Béalóidis níos leithna sin nó catá le fáil leistigh den bhosca sin.
Tá nó tá sé bhád níos leithna ná sin de ná hiúiltar gur cinlín gur seanna scéalta bháinna tá san Béalóidis ach nílann san ach píosa a bháin de tíordracha a bhfuil cinlín fiú fata farsing an hain really. Suppose in san Béalóidis fector dún cinlín réimsí agus réin lehan saolan duine ó dietfach de chána cinlín díobh slite marachtála cardan agsúla féiltín na blian agus slite íon faoi de cheúra or gradúntín na híomh agus ná dúrthacht agus sí leile dascanátha agsúil starátú lugan nach í ceol dása na simbal agus na clachtaí is was tríd Dr. Keel agus brí féile ag éisbears an tíl agus mohíim go láidir freisin in bhfuil úslucht agus alíontocht féile le rasin dontam.
Tá sin ufuasach dain mar hobar nach
Tá go dibn tá agus cé bhfuil an scéalaíocht agus an tradiisiún béal mar chud lánach agus táhachtach an obersan. Tá sin níos leithna ná an freisin mar dúirtá cin an lína material culture mar léimid ar a méle agus lehéad an na gceist agus féiltí na blian agus credunties lehead san so tá Killeen réimse farsing seal on dunne Leabharlainne san Béalóidis. So ní Killeen Romish postúil ó sean ré atá ach force river in gurta Killeen funna agus bidar sintre le.
So fechan sé docha bhfuil sin níos pásanta ná star níos cin le fechantar cin fágan neamad rudí ó lá go lá go pointe agus I gafna bliana.
Yeah, Jethos in the raw, I suppose. Mas wat ik me ha giri achtri more no dainy more the raw sa star. Mas wat ik me ha giri ring tidy and there has an Jethos hoge poppery figu no poppery start is lehet on. Agus jo for picture feile an dinne nu an over. Agus ik brahar in genal tidy ma charsulat chaffers on the end of chaffer hoge in the Fuinchi son. Ach ik na ken at kinelin tarark elle Leabharlainne. Agus dúach hir at tríd na Béalóidis Béalóidis bhfuil agan I dtí beidir chreidúntí I dtí achsrí céine. So mar hampla détáil a déine annach táid crummel nó gurta mór na rud cinint. Agus déad bhí chó tríd mar bhí rá san na popéir fiú na popéir stát ina héamhson. Ach mas go ráithach go seanachas ina héamh crummel nó seanachas ina héamh an gurta mór foioi mar achtricht daine ins na counterchaí fud fad a tíre. Jo for picture eile. Agus tá déanacht spot fé le Leabharlainne sa pictor san rud nach joffer an kinelín an dainach céine beidir is jofa trí na popéir stát seo. So kinelín is rair eile an síl. Star an gná duine a mar jedi a chur go bon.
Agus do leistín potchéile héin tá mé trééisisiach le coppla a an déime héin hána féin agus an spéisiú ar fád an lofa don reintin cinál rud a bhí tú héna agus léir léige dí seo.
Aber cad bhí an cefuil ar an céad is céad chuil síos an céad agrán agan bhí mar a brandú ar gurí an ceiste agad College Dublin an go bon. So bhí mar gurí canalín star an Béalóidis Béalóidis an 8 agus níúisteig hir agus na canalín na glúiseachtaí folletúil ach go háirid an románsachas agus náisiúnachas na Europa anar dás an canalín an réimse taidir seo agus an simán. Í sun de churmer cean chéile ar seanachas dí bhlá bealtaine agus tá annach de gestan sun. Freisin cean is déine bhí an bhí seanachas ar an ngealach fiú. So na cinalín credútí fphobal a bhí an le an ngealach agus fear an ngealachas lehéid sun. Agus nach an cean do cinalín bhí agalah agan ón chartlan so sean téip an íos na seacadíine na dahadín go bhéad agus chuirte sin is an gomór leis an ábhar bhfuil áflé agan gur féidir choch na daine iad hennig go chlos.
Agus fáintú an bhainte príomhann sin chamad.
Díach é agus tá sin ceanna na fána gur híle mar gur ceartúil ní rilí tosnú an rud seo tuis go bhfuil mit site in áit ceannas na Béalóidis smú Béalóidis agus áfar ar down and so. Is sé ach so tamid cinlín I suppose tá áit féile agan gur féidir an na seoid seo an chartan but an hadisiún ní níos generalta a réint le daine agus si de spraige si de búscail tro bhfuil hábhaach stolamte.
Agus rud gríomh lumsa faoi bheith fechan ar Béalóidis den chinál seo fecinn tú ar an géadló síos a lehéid de agsúlaachtas is atá fiú dír beag sú le héir nó go greideach muintir chéirí rud a bháin faoi choir banathe ach go greideach muintir fert láige rud am ná éagsúil faoi sin nó faoi lá ar lehí deán ó drochá baintach leis. Ach ag an ná céine tá ceangalan le cultúr orpach is gohfuil si bh caiint fao lehéint na seachtainna agus na handacha bhain le siúd mar hapla.
Tá sé sin ceannas an rudí eisteach I suppose agus sin rud a dagan leis an slíbeidir gur fearheith swinna marialar an Béalóidis seachas é bheith rud bhfuil lonathe sa námatá caite námatá hart bháin ach gur cinelín fórsa bríomh ar fórsa fuinúil atá a gceist na riire. So ar slí amháin mar bhí rán san détáil ó bailile go bailile sa áit go háit fud fad na tíre fud fad na lán agus fa creidúntí éagsú le go daine maidir le giotaí beaga in san áit in san dúthaigh héine ach Killeen, I suppose, nuair seasan tú síros an feice tú go le pictor cén tá pátrún féile Leabharlainne agus tá Killeen cé go bhfuil difriocht aber géirí agus a Bertlóige nó go bhaintán nó go béat. began on Kane to Kinolin tapestry elefrin when the rud sahalig a ris to nask le Shanachas na Heron le an Shanachas a Dave Shanachas na Europa a general so fekimid na clachti Kane nu lagnachi dus na clachti Kane in air agus fekimid in Bratten nu Album nu Herman is leheadson so vi sin le raschen te leint in schachten mar vi ra in putkele dernach an san grafeder de meal te blien de cultuur Europa ken just treat leint de schachten a glichamach a bitter Iran nu 3 hange o hiv the Dillon on Loon with the clashing Yalachach Achro the Ellenson it's a Merle Friday with the Freya Day no Freya tag Freya she can Nashana Day on Garamon so then can you the Naska dirt Nashana Day August on the rail to slate so if you on Saturn Day like Saturday is late so Shan Clachty le Russian position in some Podkrell or Yalach what's the Glen Ingrid Clashing on Tolus on the bush to Vector I suppose the Clachty shop in a willet Killeen Mion Nachre or Art Gehart affect the freshen on Pector there zooming out in a very thought picture needs move or fighter Ashkin Douglas Killeen Kangle either culture in Europa August the tier August the football last day on Ramship
August is to a kind Johnny in the show I'm seen to it's just a Heartland August a nosach Béalóidis tag of UCD Alleen kan le hasan de macht dit non piece Béalóidis no Shanachis is more hatten that is to tochelt.
Yeah, the forest and ton catch stacker a raggart ach we will learn Claire these tuske marialer le head because purchase new them gur hahan on tradition Thomas and tradition go khana kumarga semi de mon taide and kid chlorella mar vis rod mit khana kid kanala bonier rahan tea agus fin branding war kans shan the clachty be gedined guilty eggsule her fine dach sort of dog for rain so guilty her fine talach with fine tinton a bitter blisk couple nu putte nu lehead and more hample ach vi credunti eggsule negar in the haven or odisha so vi in stuff shop sort of fine tach 3-4 kind ach gan alles lagen the hagen hadishun ni ein tischkent agen kein fa horgan stuff shan so ni han de bach gelin guilty fa noch arigus orlishi eggsule sachte in art ashta gan tischkentagen in Kiel will to hear this no disha so treat bitter sample biog factor tawacht tischkentagen that is un treat the sample show mono will tischkentagen in the clachti and the credit but ni en Kiel ni agus ni fest kadi the necher so
yeah be duk so chandali fechen ne shane gitke giri Kiel vantas no sort die agus son das is special an differentiate an mat an cóhéic sin agat tuigeann tú an brí tuigeann tú an chócht atá taobhhéad an simbalachas agus tuigeann tú beidir beag an fin daoine bhíach leachta agus tócha tá an Béalóidis seo fós beo chamáin nach chuil
tá agus is fórsa mar bhí marrán is fórsa cilín fuinniúil agus bríomhar tá ní sean ráméis sé cínta atá ach fórsa fé le agus ein tíim le an méidir bearrág an son mar dear an hénig I suppose aber nervien tischken taget our dadisiún agus our airecht agus culture leit on bíon alles agan an heinig agus nervien an tolas kenne onnen agus é marlín mar chlárnacht an télagan mohib se mi nís láger mar daine on mar football fashion so kadum gur féidir agus gur fiú an force me an hadisiún úsáid chun mit hen a shorú aber agus a stúra mar football sa telchi fémar úsáid marnélig réalte spéirech ní de troú ach is mit heinig at alle fekent in hadisiún agus Béalóidis is mit heinig a charter an ildu
sin Harveh fi ar fád so is mud in a réalt a stúr an Béalóidis mud tríd a sochaí beidir
tré godir a réig nu an amat catte chuig an amatá tacht agus ach gohorid in san síle nu amsrucht or aspo tá war a gist me kinlína spastor hart gan kiel an seal gan drí gan tischkentagen téimiténig
so is loch for an óla sin Béalóidis mar sin chun an cóhéic sin hortún Johnny inis dún cáid go féit le históí teachtar an bud chuil seo
tríd SoundCloud is féidir éisteach an sunríd SoundCloud agus íslatáíana bear tríd Blúiríní Béaloidis nu folklore fragments a lureg SoundCloud an son agus freisin iTunes tríd an iTunes store an padshale le fáil tíar nasca tríd folklore fragments a lureg freshen fighter dole dagval and so I can fight the desire in the UCD but oscailt in football fresh no load gehine or dechlo go panone so fault over Ravania noch Kashnin will head on Nuggan fighter dole dagval in and so
Cín fad. Grim gachra leis an bod chuile mé tanú leis an chéad canile mé sé sin na trí cíínatá chu lína go hena féna chuasteach so ba mé bís chutá chéad canile teach nach go mór go Tá fad Jonny gur míach caiintlinn ar fis nacht.
Mar féna gangus fan.
Hello and welcome to Blúiríní Béaloidis. This is the new podcast in the National Folklore Collection with me, Jonny Dillon.
And me, Claire Doohan.
We both work here in the archives of the National Folklore Collection in University College Dublin, and we decided that it would be worthwhile to start a podcast on Irish folk tradition given the enormous wealth of folkloric material that we have at our disposal here at the archive between manuscripts, old publications in our library and audio recordings, visual recordings in the archive here. And so this podcast will act as a platform to explore Irish folk tradition from an array of subject areas and topics, and hopefully a space where people can learn about the richness and depth of our traditional cultural heritage.
Lovely. So hello folks, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping to begin with. Over the course of future episodes, we'll have a few of our colleagues here from the National Folklore Collection joining us to chat about their own areas of research and interest. And as well as that, because we have such an array of visitors to the collection with such hugely varying areas of specialisation and focus, we thought we might try and get a few of those in as well to chat to us. As well as that, we should say the podcast will be bilingual, so you will hear us having chats in English and Irish, and there will probably be a bit of toing and froing in each one. Some may be wholly in Irish, others wholly in English, but we think because the material comes in that form, I think it's quite true to respect it in that way, and we'll find our feet as we go along, so don't feel intimidated by it, and you'll always follow what we're chatting about.
One hopes.
One hopes, exactly. And so, on that point as well, we should say, so anyone who finds kind of items of interest and they'd like to follow up on, feel free to get in touch. We have our social media presence on Facebook and Twitter. We're available via phone, email, even send us a letter if you want to. I love getting a bit of post. And we'd be so happy to share further reading, further references, kind of invite you in and show you some materials. So we can't cover everything in each podcast, but do get in touch and we'll share what we know outside of this little space with you as well. Lovely. So shall we jump in, Jonny, and start where we start at the beginning of each of our tours, actually, to make sure that we're on the same page. Let's start with the question we always ask: what is folklore? It's
a good one, yeah. It's one that I always would ask students that have been teaching here in tutorials as well. Yeah. And it's one around which there's generally a lot of confusion, largely I'd say, or at least a lot of preconceptions that people have about folklore or folk tradition in general. I suppose broadly speaking, we define it as kind of cultural expressions that display certain characteristics, which we'll get into and discuss now. But generally, when I'd ask students or people when they come in for a tour, what's folklore, usually the first thing that you hear from someone is old stories. They'll think that it's just kind of to do with old stories in particular, or fairy tales largely, and it is. But it's
fairies
also
and leprechauns.
Fairies and leprechauns, in the majority of instances. But it's much broader than that, as we'll kind of go to explore and look at over the course of these episodes going forward. But it takes in, I suppose, not just storytelling, but also, I suppose, how our forebears and ancestors lived, how they related to their natural environment, what sort of crafts they had, the material culture, what sort of rituals they observed, what beliefs they had about the natural world, about the supernatural, what sort of observances they held, or how they marked certain kind of social moments like births or deaths or marriages or betrothals, how certain times throughout the year were observed, what those times meant. So apart from just what would be called oral literature or kind of storytelling, it also covers this broader aspects of social custom, social history, and material culture. But I suppose it would differ from other kind of academic or historical kind of areas of interest in that it often focuses on the quote unquote plain people, as it were. That it's not the great and the good, or the kind of
It's history from the bottom up.
Exactly. It's not a kind of interest in the mercantile classes or the elites per se. It's more from the ground, I suppose. And that was the kind of the area of the ordinary people, basically, and how they lived, and what, I suppose, what was the nature of their cultural expressions, basically.
And because it's so rich, actually, as a source, I find historians are far more interested now as well in what it can tell us about how people lived, and that we would have dismissed folklore for those who thought it was simply the oral literature, but actually there's so much social history caught up there that can add such depth to work that is being kind of taken from national archives and the official records.
Absolutely, yeah. Know? It's I suppose if you're to look at some large historical event, and you're to focus on state papers or certain documents, you'll get an insight certainly into the particular area of interest that you have. But if you look at, say, how that material entered into the broader folk tradition or perception, you'll get another view of what or how people related to certain practices or events in their own community. The famine is a good example here. Certainly, you can look at statistics on the famine and how many deaths or where did people go or how many lived or died. But if you're to look at some of the kind of customs and beliefs pertaining to what happened, and from that kind of memory, even if it's distilled through several generations, you'll start to see a broad and a very kind of different picture emerge that often reveals some of the more human elements.
And that's the word, I think, human, isn't it?
Yeah. Sean O'Sullivan, I think, who we'll talk about later as well, who's the archivist for the Folklore Commission, he mentioned how I think that folk tradition or folklore for him showed some of the highest expressions of humanity and nobility in a people or whatever. But I suppose to get to the definitions of folklore and folk tradition itself, it's not just storytelling, although storytelling kind of plays a part, but it would also, I suppose, be material culture and ritual observances and communal observances and so on. But largely speaking, these would have the same characteristics overall. So if you were to look at, say, a certain folk tale or a legend, or even a traditional house type or something like that, you'll find that they'll display the same kind of characteristics. Largely they're anonymous. That is to say that there's no set author for a custom or a practice. No one has no author has a claim to this is how Halloween was celebrated, or this is or owns a particular ballad. They're kind of anonymous in that sense. They're passed on traditionally, obviously, from our forebears, or from kind of peer to peer in certain instances or groupings. They're often passed on orally by customary example or spoken from person to person, and then in their form they're often stable, in that you'll see the same kind of customs and the same maybe framework over a large area, but they're variable. They vary to reflect the environment that they're in. So a custom on the east coast of Ireland, you might find another version of it on the west coast, but both of them reflect their own environments, which is something that points to the fact that folklore is very much a living thing.
I was just going to say, actually, because a lot of people talk about it as a product, so something comes to us and it lives in the archive and it dies in the archive, but actually it's on a spectrum, which is what we always say in our tours. It's a process. Like, folklore is happening around us. We have our folklore in 2017 as our children and our grandchildren will. So you are quite right. It's not something that dies and it's 1920s to 1940s. That's it. That's folklore. It continues.
No, it's living. It's a living force. It's a dynamic force. And it's a force in which the kind of vital energies of a people find expression in their material culture, in their urban culture, in their rural culture or agrarian culture, and it finds expression in the contemporary period as well. There's a quote here from Jonny where he says, "Old though folklore be in its origins, it is nevertheless a living thing. It is continually changing and developing at a slow rate by incorporating new ideas." So that it points to the fact of it being very much a living force. And folklore, of course, does die, and customs do live and die, not by virtue necessarily of they're being collected or coming to an archive, but often it's precisely when a custom stops relating to the environment in which it's expressing itself and stops having a function in that sense. It's basically taken out and shot. It becomes kind of
if it's
useless.
Unnecessary.
If it's unnecessary, yeah.
Because folklore does serve a function.
A set purpose.
Absolutely.
And we can kind of lament the loss of certain traditions, and many have, kind of retrospectively or from a certain view, but on the ground, as it were, when certain storytelling practices become, or they don't reflect the modes of entertainment anymore in a community, then they just disappear. So you have something that maybe existed for hundreds upon hundreds, if not longer periods, not of years, that suddenly becomes effectively equivalent like an oxbow lake that then dries up. So many of the storytelling practices that were part and parcel of Irish life and broader European life for a great many centuries kind of came to an end. Certainly some of those epic narratives and cycles. So it does live and die, but it's that living force, and it's very much something that it has a set function. It's not some leftover of a kind of maladapted age or something like that. It has a very kind of specific function, I suppose. But largely these are expressions that are anonymous, that are passed on traditionally, and that are kind of stable and variable in their form, and that they're unofficial. You don't have government sponsored kind of, here's the directive for 2017 instructions on skipping games syllabus to be practiced in school. It doesn't really, it's more organic in that sense.
And one point that you made that I think is really important that a lot of people perhaps don't understand about folklore is the urban-rural divide. Because a lot of people, when I speak to them about folklore and what we do here, they imagine rural Ireland in the 30s to 60s, Irish-speaking storytelling, and they don't appreciate that folklore exists in the urban environment, as it would make sense that it does. And I think people as well are surprised when we discuss things like, and we'll discuss this in kind of future podcasts about the Urban Folklore Project and the work that we've done to try and rebalance that kind of dichotomy that we have here. Although, of course, we started focusing on the rural initially, which we'll chat about shortly when we do the history of the collection. But urban folklore is hugely rich as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's something
and the
not
urban
to forget.
folklore, it's one of the I suppose it's an assumption for which people would be forgiven, assuming that folk tradition only exists in a rural capacity. Largely, I suppose, in many instances, that the collections that were made in the earliest phase focused specifically on those areas. And it was fair enough that they focused on those areas, and that they were, I suppose, often in a process of urbanization or modernization, and rituals and customs and practices of all sorts were seen to be in danger of dying out, and the collecting efforts in many instances focused on those areas. Much to the neglect of urban areas, specifically in the city centre in Dublin, for example. There wouldn't have been dedicated folklore collections occurring there really until 1979, the Urban Folklore Project. But you find a huge and enormously rich and interesting array of material that expresses itself in those environments, as you must when there's so many people kind of put together. Street games or slang or certain crafts or even supernatural beliefs, all sorts. So it's absolutely not a kind of a specifically rural, although there is
when you get a group of people anywhere, they will have their folklore.
Yes, exactly. It's a way of relating to the immediate environment, the natural environment around you, and it's something often that provides a kind of symbolic meaning for people as well. That these customs, or supernatural beliefs, or narratives, and even material culture will often have these allegorical kind of lessons in them. And so I suppose what you see is the kind of artistry and wisdom of our forebears distilled over an enormously long period of time into these traditions, into these customs, that then show ways of living, for want of a better word, or reactions to the environment largely. But that's both an urban and a rural phenomenon.
And so I think we've kind of explained really nicely what folklore is there, and to kind of get rid of these misconceptions that people have, that we do have rural and urban folklore, and those three elements, the oral element, the material, and then the customary element, which I think is important. If people take nothing else away from our ramblings, it's that folklore is so much more than just the oral literature aspect.
Yes, and it is actually, even just looking at those, the groupings I have there, kind of oral literature, material culture, and then the social folk custom and so on, they're kind of they're quite unsatisfactory in a way even themselves, because if you pull on one, the whole structure of moves. It's
Absolutely.
A broad landscape.
And they're so linked, aren't they?
Yeah, the way I often would have explained it as well to students, if we're looking at this, basically we're exploring a broad landscape of custom, tradition and meaning, for want of a better word. And when you view it from the perspective of oral literature, you look at its, hills and valleys and so on from one angle.
Yeah.
and certain elements stand out in sharp relief. But then when you observe it from the perspective of material culture, you just look at that same landscape from a different angle. But you'll find, say, material culture will bleed into oral literature. The objects and items found in the narratives will reflect those found in the natural environment. It's all a product of the natural environment. Often the items that are kind of found or used by people as part of folk life or material culture, so-called, will express some of the more spiritual elements of folk tradition than just the physical. And then social folk custom will stand halfway in between, with, again, calendar observances that will involve maybe effigies or divination about the future or bonfires or certain foods. So it's this kind of a broad tapestry of tradition and culture and meaning that all kind of mesh together. So I suppose when we use these groupings to analyse those different areas, we're looking at it just this broad landscape, but from one angle. But nothing will ever fit neatly into the boxes that we want them to, largely.
That's life, Jonny.
That is life. That is the case.
It's better that we learn it now.
Yes, true enough. True enough, yeah.
And so is this a good point to jump into the history of Folklore Collection, which I find fascinating anyway,
yeah.
and where it began, and then perhaps if we look at the broader picture of what was happening in Europe in the 19th century when this whole idea of folklore collection and preserving heritage and culture, how that came about, what the driving forces were, and then we can perhaps move on to looking at the impact that had then on the Irish experience and how our own methods were coloured by that, but also what we might have done differently.
Yeah. It's it is a really interesting area of how this whole kind of, I suppose, interest in certain aspects of culture came about. I suppose it's one, you have to go back even to the period of the Enlightenment period in the kind of 17th century Europe and even further afield, I suppose, to consider the political, the philosophical kind of climate at the time, and intellectual climate at the time. And many of the individuals who appear in the 19th century or the late 18th century with an interest in, say, the quote-unquote vulgar rights of the peasantry or whatever, were displaying a certain kind of reaction to or movement against some of the rigidity of post-Enlightenment thinking, or of Enlightenment thinking, I suppose. That
because they called it the tyranny of tradition, didn't they?
The Enlightenment thinkers, it would have been a very kind of rationalist, anti-traditional, anti-spiritual, anti-religious, I guess materialistic kind of, I suppose, precursor for modernity in many ways.
Yeah, very much so driving towards modernity.
Yeah, that was the philosophical outlook, and a lot of the, I suppose, as one might expect, maybe it was more of the artists on who were reacting, I suppose, to this kind of overwhelming tendency in life. As well, you had then the huge changes that manifested all over Europe with the onslaught of the Industrial Revolution.
And you've got printing as well, which comes into it, and the impact that has.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I suppose you have the movement towards urbanization, modernization, the Industrial Revolution, a kind of a vast upheaval really occurring in a very short amount of time. You should consider, say, towns and villages all over Europe from, the medieval or period, saying largely the modes of life and practices being in many ways at least similar than how they had over a long period of time, and then very, very suddenly these huge upheavals and changes in thought and in living conditions and so on. So a lot of the kind of the people who reacted to this and against it were largely artists often. And you had people like, say, the kind of the romanticists who were interested in nature and the sublime and in tradition and all this. But as well as that, then you had the kind of nationalists in Europe and the romantic nationalist movement in Germany and in England and I suppose further afield.
And this is interesting. This is where kind of cultural nationalism, when it comes into it, and because you don't often associate one, or you wouldn't necessarily, someone who's coming to it for the first time wouldn't associate it with folklore. Because it's folklore is all fun and fuzzy and
warm and fuzzy feelings.
Warm and fuzzies, yeah. So
yeah.
they don't cultural nationalism and political nationalism. You just don't imagine them to be bedfellows. With folklore initially,
And yet, I suppose you could argue that in its earliest inceptions, it is the driving force. It was largely politically conservative. It was acting often against many of the corrosive impacts of modernisation and
in Ireland and in Europe.
Absolutely, from the 18th century and 19th century on. And I suppose one of the things as well that you have is an interest not in the elites or the very kind of mercantile or banking, these kind of upper echelons or whatever of society, but an interest in the common man and woman, and the rural peasantry specifically, who in a sense were viewed now as bearers of an ancient civilization, and that by virtue of examining their rights and customs, that the spirit of the nation somehow, the spirit of the people would be revealed in that.
Yeah.
And that would be revealed in something that was antithetical to the process of urbanization largely that was occurring. So those were usually the political lens to which this kind of movement was geared, or at least towards which some of these artists with these kind of inclinations and feelings began to look towards items of folk tradition and to examine them. So in 1746 you have Relics of Ancient English Poetry, a collection of ballads that was published that influenced the Brothers Grimm in Germany.
And they're big names now.
Yes,
let's
absolutely.
talk about the Brothers Grimm.
But they were kind of, I mean, they were hugely influential and hugely famous in their day as well, not just as folklorists, but as kind of language scholars and legal scholars and so on and so forth. And they began to collect and publish items of folk tradition, specifically material from oral literature, folk tales, in a book, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, published in 1812.
And that's children and household tales.
Yes.
Which I find it's often translated as Grimm's fairy tales, but technically it's children and household tales.
Yeah.
And not very child friendly necessarily.
No, very often. Yeah, often kind of they were sanitized later on in many ways. But yeah, when you read versions of Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella and so on, they're often a lot more
very grim
darker,
grim by subject.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, even for example, lullabies often you'd find tradition are often very kind of murderous and dark, as you're kind of lulling some child to sleep about I don't know, these kind of particularly kind of macabre subjects, whatever.
Absolutely.
But the Brothers Grimm would have collected and published these stories, but they would have kind of amended them, having kind of published them first, basically.
Can I read a quote?
Yeah,
I love a quote. You'll come to know that, folks. So in the first edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, I'm going to have to apologise for my pronunciation as we go through this, and that was 1812.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, our first aim in collecting these stories has been exactness and truth. We've added nothing of our own, have embellished no incident or feature of the story, but have given it substance just as we ourselves received it. Which, as a folklorist, I find that hugely interesting, because there's often a bad reputation about the literary style of folktales, which we won't get into too much because it's not the theme of this introductory podcast. But actually the Grimms were hugely scientific in a way, which Douglas Hyde, who we'll come to later, praised highly as a style. So they weren't just out speaking to Joe and Josephine blogs and then writing up their stories for a literary audience, which we'll come to next as an impact that we see in Ireland particularly. But they were actually very methodical and systematic about their methods. And in that first edition, their notes on each story, they're remarkable because they give such detailed overviews of where they found them, and if another version existed, they'll actually put that in the notes as well, and they'll speak about where themes arise and what that means in the context of their community, and also if they have kind of international correlations. So they'll speak about and kind of themes in or stories in Scotland that had the same themes. They were hugely knowledgeable.
Yeah.
They weren't just out having a nice time collecting stories.
It's funny because actually just that quote you read would be quite a counterintuitive for me when I would think of lots of the 19th century collections of folk tradition, that they were prone to embellishment and prone to changing them and prone to artistry, really, because that's what they were. They were writers and poets and artists and so on. But I suppose they were quite exact. And one of the things you mentioned as well, the collecting of different versions is important, and it's important that it's kind of viewed as this was a kind of a comparative discipline, in that there was a broader European culture or heritage that was being explored and examined, and the idea was that if you were to collect kind of certain versions of narratives, that you would begin to find or be able to trace its genesis or the origin of a custom or a tale. And by doing that, you could kind of get to the oldest roots of Indo-European civilization, largely. You could do that by looking at certain linguistic terms and archaic terms that were found in the speech, in the ordinary speech of people and so on, to see that here's their common root between certain words. You could look at certain narratives and so on and so forth. And that by collecting large amounts of these narratives and different versions of them, you'd be able to kind of paint a picture of, I suppose, the spread and the historic and geographic spread of these narratives. That was then, I suppose, a theory and approach to folk tradition that was kind of lambasted and attacked later on for not really kind of pointing to or considering the deeper functionality of it, or an individual's repertoire in their community, and the kind of how that relates to the broader scheme of things, really.
Hindsight, though, is the only true clear vision. It's very easy for us to come afterwards, isn't it?
Totally.
And we often discuss this. We kind of treat people very harshly without realising the context of the time.
Totally. I remember with one of the other characters, the 19th century characters, who when I first began to get interested in folklore and folk tradition, it was Thomas Crofton Croker. And I just found it, I just was so kind of...
not a fan, Jonny?
No, I was not a fan of poor Thomas Crofton Croker. And I've come to really warm to him over the years. But he would have been one of the figures in Ireland who would have been particularly influential in the documenting of not just folktales and literature and legends and so on, but also customs, examples of wakes and so on and so forth that he has his recollections of. But there are instances where he kind of overdoes it, and you see the kind of Paddy the Stage Irishman take centre stage, basically. And that was something, I suppose, for which the likes of Crofton Croker and his ilk received flack later on.
Because they were writing for a specific literate middle upper class audience, weren't they? And they were booksellers, weren't they? Yeah, so they had to write nice stories.
That's it.
That people would enjoy reading.
And they adapted them. They took them and they would embellish them or add them as they saw fit, and kind of adapt them and change them into something else. But that was a perspective of where they were coming from. And the Brothers Grimm Crofton Croker's books were translated into German, so there was a kind of a cross pollination, or that broad kind of wider European interest in European heritage and inheritance as well. That was shown as well by lots of the kind of scholars who were very aware of what was going on in each other's countries. And we were talking earlier on about nationalism and so on as well. And this was very much a part of where this material was kind of coming from as well. You had people like Lady Wilde, or Speranza is her pen name, Oscar Wilde's mother.
Absolutely.
And she published poetry and text and so on and so forth, but utilised them often in that kind of to nationalistic ends to further the Irish nationalist movement. So you have, in that sense, the elites of a kind of vanguard political movement utilising items of the kind of more communal grassroots folk tradition to show what the nation is or could be, or what the idea of the nation should be, and kind of using that material in another very ideological way, basically, as has been the case.
As you said, the idea is the word there, because it wasn't necessarily an accurate representation of what the country was. You know, it was idealised. And again, what struck me reading about the likes of Thomas Crofton Croker and Lady Wilde, they wouldn't have been Irish speakers, so a lot of the material that they would have gotten, they would have received through translators, wouldn't they? So it wouldn't have been first-hand, you and I sitting speaking, and them understanding the language it was being performed in or given in, which is hugely interesting to what we'll come to later about accurate recording of traditions, customs and stories. Yeah,
you're right. And it is with the idea of the nation as a thing, or there's an ideological basis to it, there's a symbolic kind of aspect to it, there's a political or nationalist aspect to it. There's also, I suppose, there is a kind of a nostalgic, there's a longing for, the pain of home, I think is what the Greek means, that there's that idea to kind of return to an origin or a golden past of some sort or another, that is being largely kind of, I suppose, erased or undone by the onslaught of the modern experience and urbanisation and so on. You had to quote William Toms, who coined the term folklore in 1846. He called it a fine Anglo-Saxon compound. He had a quote.
He did. I'll read this out. In 1846, the railroad mania was at its height, and the iron horse was transplanting underfoot all our ancient landmarks and putting to flight all the relics of our early popular mythology. And this is William Toms writing later, but as you quite rightly said, he coined the word folklore in 1846, and that's what he was fighting against, I suppose, as the Irish did later.
Yeah. So if anything, I mean, you have, I suppose, a movement against the industrial, or the industrialisation of many communities, the urbanisation. In Ireland, you have, I suppose, a movement to increase cultural autonomy, and the nationalist movement in that regard, and to go to the old symbols and narratives and epic cycles and so on, and to kind of recast them as part of an ideologically nationalist, largely politically conservative kind of, but revolutionary as well in its way, movement largely, and that's what kind of underpins some of the groundwork across Europe, and then obviously into Ireland more broadly. And you see that change then that comes along with, say, the likes of Douglas Hyde, who's a hugely influential figure as well, we can talk about, and then his student of his, James Seamus O'Larga, who is enormously influential and visionary figure as far as the collecting of folklore, not just in Ireland but further afield.
One of our founding fathers, who
Absolutely,
we'll come back to like time and time again.
I mean, even if there's that quote of his in the Handbook of Irish Folklore, if I can find it now, where he says, like Tom's, but this is published in 1942, so almost 100 years later, the entire fabric of Irish rural civilization, so well portrayed in the present volume, is today, as in the past, beset by many enemies. Here, as elsewhere, the shoddy, imported culture of the towns pushes back the frontiers of the indigenous homespun culture of the countryside, and the ancient courtesies and traditional ways of thought and behaviour tend to disappear before the destroying breath of the spirit of the age, as he says at the end. So it's very similar in its
history.
Emotional
just
kind
happens in cycles, doesn't it?
It absolutely
they're
does.
seeing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and they're reacting to many of the same processes, and the sense of erasure and the sense of, I suppose, a loss of identity, a lack of identity, and it's being reduced or just cast off and so on and so forth. So there's a sense of, I suppose, emergency and crisis about much of what's occurring as well, that this needs to be saved, this material has to be saved. From the likes of Crofton Croker and Patrick Kennedy, who's another individual who published items of legendary and folktales and so on and so forth, and John Millington Singh is another one who has some fantastic accounts of early life and material culture and so on. You have Douglas Hyde then, who was a hugely influential figure, who established in 1893 Cunnan na Gaeilge, and was Ireland's first president as well, and had as a student of his James Hamilton de Largy, Seirbhís.
And that's the link, isn't it?
That's the link, yeah. And this is in around the 1900 where these scholars who are studying kind of Celtic studies, the Irish language and folk tradition and narrative and so on and so forth, that they have become sick. De Largy said he was sick of the rubbish that passes for folklore, and there was a movement against, say, the overindulgence in this kind of stage Irish
the literary style, inaccurate representation.
So they wanted to move into a much more kind of scientific area, but if anything, that was quite a mechanical shift as opposed to a spiritual one. They're still reacting against the same things. They still have the same ideological basis or bent or trajectory to much of what they're trying to achieve, but the way that they go about doing it shifts quite radically. And that's where the kind of government institutions in collecting folklore, that's where they kind of come into play in the not 19th century, sorry, the early 20th century, early 1900s.
And I think that's a good point, in that all of these people that we've been looking at before, so say the likes of the Grimm brothers, Patrick Kennedy, William Wilde, Jeremiah Curtin, who we didn't mention, but people who are familiar with folklore will know Jeremiah Curtin, William Laramie, Lady Wilde. All of these were individuals working in the field. There was no actually concerted effort or organisation at the time, which is the big shift for Ireland, isn't it, in the 20th century, when Douglas Hyde and the likes of Seirbhís O'Larga and Finan McCullum and Shoke, when they start thinking about, we need a communal effort now, we need
a national
state funded organisation.
Yeah, that was the big change. And Seirbhís O'Larga, I guess, is a hugely visionary individual who went about achieving enormous amounts of progress, largely in that regard. I suppose the first maybe groups that one would point to in that sense would be the Folklore of Ireland Society and College Dublin, which we're happy to say is still alive and kicking. We just recently elected our new president. I think there's been 4 presidents since 1926 when it was established. Douglas Hyde is one. An Seabhach, Andrew Sumínachán, Andrea Brennan, and now Eilish Níoine.
Just good pedigree.
Absolutely, yes, indeed. But the Folklore of Ireland Society was established in 1926 by the likes of Seirbhís O'Larga, Douglas Hyde, of Finan McCullum, and these sorts of figures who were hugely interested in doing something about basically what they saw as the disappearance of the old cultural strands and old order. The Folklore Violence Society was a voluntary body, and it began collecting and organising in a methodological way, in a scientific way, scientific insofar as that it was meant to be kind of rigorously organised and not prone to embellishment or any of this sort of stuff. And that was the aim, to kind of start to document this material in quite an organised fashion, so that it could be saved for posterity and reproduced in the printed word and published and all sorts of stuff as well.
And used.
And used, but held
used
in an
by
archive
scholars,
then as well, that would be kind of held centrally. That again, like you'd see with the Brothers Grimm, there's the idea if you collect all these versions, you'll get an idea of the overall picture of a custom or a wider Indo-European heritage. Similarly, all these versions and variants of narratives were to be collected, but also their contextual details had to be collected. You shouldn't change the archaic turns of phrase or correct the grammar of an individual who was using them either. So there's that, like I said, a mechanical shift from the 19th century, not a spiritual one, in which they still have the same, or a great many of the same ideological kind of perspectives, but there's a mechanical shift in how it's meant to be prepared. I have a quote here, or a piece of audio from the archive, we should play maybe of Dillargy himself.
Actually.
And he's talking about the sense of urgency, basically, that he felt at the time to...
and we'll try to incorporate clips
material
from the archive as much as we can.
Whether there's so much.
It is, and it's so rich, so whether it's audio or from the manuscripts, we hope you enjoy it.
So this is Dillargy talking about basically the need to collect.
I realised that the old house was on fire, and it was about time some of the furniture was taken out before the whole thing went up. In other words, the civilization which had lasted here, Gaelic civilization, which had lasted here for so many centuries, but now it was disintegrating. So that I suppose the desire to save, the urge to save, a burning urge to save. And I have done something in that regard, and I feel glad of that, but I feel sorry too, because I realise how little I have done, and how little we in the Irish folklore have done, compared to what there was to be done.
So that was Dillargy talking to us about the sense of urgency that you find that comes across in the publications, the introductions to the likes of the Handbook of Irish Folklore, which you can talk about. This sense of urgency to save basically the kind of vestiges of the old ways largely. And as he says, as Dillargy says in the introduction to Sean Sullivan's Handbook of Irish Folklore, that he wants to see these customs and our forebears in a sense known and honoured. That they shouldn't just be kind of disappear into the kind of wastes of time basically. And he saw that as a broader European, he saw Western kind of European civilization and the mind of kind of European man largely present in these older customs, that it was the broader, it looked further afield and wasn't entirely insular. It was a wider European kind of movement.
The strength of the Irish experience comes into it, isn't it? And again, we'll touch on the Scandinavian influence that we had in the mentors that the likes of Seamus de Larga had from Sweden and Norway. But if you're looking at Kuno Meyer, he speaks about, when he calls Ireland's early literature the earliest voice from the dawn of West European civilization, and the Scandinavian scholars recognised the treasure that we had here before we did, because we were largely kind of left untouched by, say, kind of the Roman onslaught that England and Britain would have been, and so along our western coasts and into the Midlands, we did have those remnants that had long passed out of memory elsewhere, and they recognised that in a way that the Irish didn't until I suppose Hyde and Dillargy and those who kind of came to make a concerted effort now thought it's now or never, isn't it?
Yes, but you had a huge interest of international scholars, of Scandinavians and Swedish scholars in particular are hugely important. We mentioned, I suppose, the mechanical shift from the very artistic and kind of embellished inclinations in the 19th century to the publication of folk tradition, and then moved into this other aspect, a kind of much more mechanical, methodological kind of collection of tradition that would then go in an archive and for public use and consultation as well. So there's this kind of other element to it. But before all that material could be arranged and kind of organised, the scholars in Ireland needed to establish the framework through which this was to be done. And the Swedish scholars were hugely I suppose we are hugely indebted to the early Swedish scholars in a sense for providing us with that framework, which was then adapted to suit the Irish experience and Irish conditions largely.
And many of our staff were trained in Sweden
Yes,
and
absolutely.
in Norway and
Yeah,
thereabouts to learn the methods.
Sean O'Sullivan in 1935 travelled to Sweden, and there was taught the systems of classification that we still use now in the National Folklore Collection here to organise the material that we have, and then also to organise all future material largely that comes in. And his efforts were published in a fantastic book, The Handbook of Irish Folklore.
We call it the Leabharlainne, the second Leabharlainne, the second holy book, because we use it on a daily basis, don't we?
It's incredible. It's an encyclopedia of folk customs. Well, again, actually, as a quote, it's again Delargy in his preface to the book. He says, "This book is an encyclopedia of Irish and indeed of West European tradition as well. It is an inventory of the long neglected and in great part unknown archive to which every age and generation of our people has contributed over the limitless wastes of time, a treasure house of fact and fancy, of ritual and observance, of custom and belief." There's that kind of broader European kind of context to it largely. But the Swedish scholars, this book is dedicated to the Swedish scholars and people, in fact, from Sean O'Sullivan in his dedication, who I suppose gave us basically the systems of classification that we use. And in going back to the start of saying, well, what is folklore and why would you need these systems of classification? Because it covers all aspects of human life. It covers settlement and dwelling, communications and trade, historical tradition, religious tradition, clothing, recipes, foods, cures, the supernatural. There's a dizzying array of material.
I love what Sean O'Sullivan says, the lore of man and all his numerous activities, but I should probably correct that and say the lore of all people and all their activities, what they say, what they do and what they make.
That's it. That is it. And even the book itself is fantastic. It's 800 pages largely of questions, but it's fantastically detailed, and it's instructions to folklore collectors. So Delargy, as you heard there in a sample, saying that having a burning urge to save, begins to establish these groups, the first of whom is the Folklore of Ireland Society. It was then very quickly realised that a volunteer group like the Folklore of Ireland Society couldn't quite manage the task at hand of kind of saving the entire field of Irish folklore largely. And to that end, in 1930, the Irish Folklore Institute was established, which was recognised by the state. But in 1935, the big kind of, I suppose, change came about when Delargy convinced Eamon de Valera at the time to, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister at the time, to put aside £100 to collect folklore in each county across Ireland, to which de Valera agreed. And then the Irish Folklore Commission was set up. And with the setting up of the Irish Folklore Commission, you had, I suppose, a visionary director in Delargy, but you also had his very insightful and kind of keen ability to convert basically a great many volunteers, teachers all over the country, to the aim of collecting folklore, and then also to hire collectors full-time and part-time to work in their own communities, in Irish, in English, collecting where they'd be working among people who trust them.
Absolutely, because you don't want the blow-ins coming in to
no,
be suspicious.
No, you do not. You do not want the blow-ins coming in to kind of ask strange questions about strange topics. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Do you make poutine around here? Where is your still? Those sorts of things, or bring down the wrath of the local constabulary or priest, or something. You don't want these sorts of things at all. So you want somebody who can be trusted and so on. So, and Delargy had a very keen ability to bring into his ranks some enormously gifted individuals who collected tens of thousands worth of pages of primary source material, which we now have in the manuscripts, not to mention photographs, their own contributions, academic contributions and so on, video recordings. But you had people, these folklore collectors, and we should do episodes on them.
I think so, because they're hugely fascinating in their own right, aren't they?
Incredible, absolutely incredible. Travelling the country, talking to men and women in their houses about all manner of aspects of life and custom and culture and so on. But that work was largely done and brought about by this book, The Handbook of Irish Folklore, that collectors would follow and literally quote verbatim the questions from it. I'll go through some of the questions and instructions maybe briefly, but before I do that,
shall we listen to?
This is Delargy describing how he met de Valera and how he convinced him to establish the Irish Folklore Commission. The quality isn't as good as the last recording, but sure, we should be able to make it out.
But I remember very well through Senator Joseph Connolly, who came from the same part of Ireland as I did, and the Glens of Antrim, and who arranged the matter. I had an interview with Mr. de Valera many years ago, to be exact, 1934. And it was the night of the budget, and officials were coming into him, into his room, and he was pushing them aside, and the he talked about something. He talked about his youth. And when he was a boy, that he had heard folk tales told in English, of course, in County Limerick. And he went on talking, and then I couldn't. It was a tense moment for me, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, I don't speak the language of diplomacy." Just one thing to say to you. The material is there, it's dying, and you know it. You're interested in the Irish language, as I am. And I think it's about time something was done to put on paper or to record in some way the old tradition of a silent people who, as I said a moment ago, had so much to say. So please, take that pen in your hand and write, "Let it be done," and I'll do it, get other people to help me. And that's how the Folklore Commission started.
He had some gumption, didn't he?
Oh, he did.
I'll use the word gumption. Just to go in and it needs to be done, it needs to be done now.
It's fantastic.
My way or the highway.
Yeah, largely, yeah. And I suppose it was with that meeting that the Irish Folklore Commission was established. I've read the correspondence inside between Delargy and Reidar Christiansen, the Norwegian folklorist, where he comes out of that meeting or the day after, and he writes him a letter saying that, we've got it, we've done it, it's established, So it's fantastic,
There's no bureaucracy, is there? There's no, I'll reply to you in 3 to 4 days,
it seems,
2 months later,
and
we'll discuss money. And
as he said himself, he doesn't speak the language of diplomacy, it's hilarious. But in 1935, when the Folklore Commission was established, that same year, the spring of that year, Sean O'Sullivan travelled to Sweden and he compiled this book, the Handbook of Irish Folklore, or at least he began the process of familiarising himself with the methods of organising folklore and folk tradition, and the Handbook of Irish Folklore is a result. And this would have been given, there were 1,000 copies printed in 1942, it was quite a rare book, and then there was another, I think, reprint in 1963 and then in 1970, but it's kind of hard to get copies overall. But there are instructions to folklore collectors. There's 14 of them here, but we can go through a brief example of some of them. So Sean O'Sullivan indicates, or he suggests that he says, record the information in the exact words of the speaker if possible. Make no corrections or changes. And further on he says, if the informant spoke in Irish, record the information in that language. Write it down in English if it was given in English. And then he says that the collector should state clearly, either on a slip affixed at the head of each item or else as a note at the end, the name, age and full address of the person from whom he recorded the information. It is most important that the source of each piece of information be given correctly. So you see again that mechanical shift between the Croft and Crogers and Sperances of this world into this other kind of more methodological, kind of scientific, for want of a better word, approach to the material. But this kind of, I feel that the spiritual kind of orientation or trajectory behind it is largely the same. It's that kind of, it's not scientific and dry and objective, it's emotional, and it's
but it's important to have both, isn't it? Because it means that the collection for us now is so much more valuable because we can trust it to a large degree. We have all this information about, so each one, as Sean was saying, each piece of material, when visitors come to us and they view a manuscript, will have the name of the collector, where they're from, the county they're collecting in, the name of their informant, as we would have called the storyteller or the person giving the piece of social history, their garmbehe or their profession at the time, the date, their age, and then interestingly where they live and also where they heard the story from, so that you can start to trace pieces of information or stories between parishes. And this hadn't been done before. So actually what they're doing in the Scandinavian model is hugely pioneering for the Irish experience, but for us now as folklorists and scholars looking back, it just means that it's tested information and it's trustworthy and reliable.
It can be cleanly analysed then. And there was even, they'd ask, well, where do you live and where did you grow up if it was somewhere else, and where did you hear it and where did they live and where did they grow up? So you can begin to plot the trajectory or arc of a certain custom, or look at its contextual details, because if you now have a manuscript with hundreds of stories in it but no indication of who told them, where they came from, a huge part of the information just becomes lost to you, and you can only look at the linguistic kind of vehicle itself, the words on the paper now largely.
And that's interesting when you say linguistic, because again that kind of touches on, was Douglas Hyde had a quote where he's kind of really looking down on the style that had gone before, when it's captured without context and without kind of due respect to the language that it was given in. So, for example, we see it here in the manuscripts as well, that the collectors were told, as you read there, collect it as you hear it, in the language you hear it. So for us reading kind of pieces of information or tales in the manuscripts, it doesn't read like an enjoyable book in the sense that Thomas Crofton Croker would have had it, or Lady Wilde. It's very stilted sometimes, and kind of unnatural in a way to read it when we're so used to novels and things, that style. But actually it's more authentic because they are recording it as they heard it from that person. So it's the most accurate representation of the performance, or the kind of the process of giving that information that we can possibly have, which again is so important.
Totally, yeah. It's one of the kind of it can be very strange sometimes reading some stories in the manuscripts, and like you said, they come across and they can seem quite very strange or hard to work out the jumps or where they're going, but they're often they've been transcribed directly by the collector. Douglas Hyde, in the introduction to one of his books as well, I forget which now, he says that if you want to collect stories from someone, never to kind of start straight away asking, oh, so Claire, tell me the story, and I could stop there and kind of start.
Let me get that down.
Yeah, but to let them just run through in one sweep, and then ask them again, oh, I'd like to get that on paper, or do you mind saying that again? And then as they go through it again, to maybe pull them up a little bit so you can, but they literally just be writing it down. Or making early recordings onto wax cylinder and the Epiphone recorder, which is this kind of hugely clunky device that was kind of powered by a spring, a handle that you turn, and you put a wax cylinder, like a hollow handle, onto it, and a person could speak for about 5 minutes onto this recording, and then they'd have to stop, change the cylinder, carry on. You might be there for a couple of hours with someone, and then the collector would cycle off to their house, and they
the rain.
In the rain, no doubt. It has to be raining, of course, raining
Absolutely,
sideways.
when you're collecting folklore.
And then they'd have to transcribe all of this material. And if you ever listen to the quality of the wax cylinders, which we should play over the course of future episodes, they're absolutely awful, I find. They're just this kind of screechy, scratchy noise from the material itself, and then a very faint kind of signal in the background, which is also one of the reasons that collectors often were employed in their own areas. If you're working in the English language or the Irish language, that you'd know the dialectical kind of content of that language, and that you could navigate it with ease. Because if I was suddenly to be plonked in Donegal or in Tyrone or something like that, or whatever, working in English or Irish, it could get difficult quite quickly,
And they speak about that a lot, because we're currently in the process of digitising our collection of scrapbooks here in the National Folklore Collection, and a lot of the material, it always surprises me how much folklore was discussed in those early years in national papers, that they would give pages and pages to this, again kind of tying in with that idea of cultural nationalism that you were talking about. But and they would pick up on such items as that, as verbatim recording, and how important it was. And you see instances of people writing in, perhaps with letters about the latest review of the Béalóidis journal, which is the journal of the Folklore of Ireland Society, saying, and they're largely positive throughout, but then you will see, I saw one where he was giving out, this gentleman, that a piece of information was collected, and it obviously wasn't verbatim, because now, again, this is from Donegal, but we're largely very friendly up there. We very rarely complain, but he did write in to say that this piece of information that was obviously collected in Donegal, and he gave the sentence which to an Irish speaker in Donegal you would recognise wasn't natural as how we would say it. And so he was kind of bringing them to task that if you're going to record it, you should record it verbatim as it's spoken, in order to kind of get the full benefit of the dialect, which again was one of the functions, to kind of get all the dialects of kind of the Irish language. But it's so hugely interesting to me that they were so focused and being so methodical and so accurate and so correct at that time, because they saw the huge importance of what they were doing.
The importance of it was recognised, and likewise it's reflected in the fact of its coverage extensively by the national newspapers at the time. When you go to our scrapbooks here from 1927, when the Folklore of Ireland Society is established, you have all these newspaper cuttings from all the national papers with huge spreads on this, what is seen as a momentous event that has occurred, and Dr. Christiansen's stirring lecture to the Folklore of Ireland Society, and on its importance. Its importance is recognised and understood as being inherent.
It's true. Well, we've brought us up to 1935, and that that the beginning of that kind of flurry of activity in Ireland And so the folklore, or the Irish Folklore Commission, is founded in 1935. There were never more than 10 full-time collectors. They were all men at the time when they started, but in time we would have male and female part-time collectors. And so the collectors were sent out into across the country, and they covered all of Ireland. So is that a matter for another day, or?
Well, we should go into it maybe briefly now, I suppose, but it certainly is something that we could cover. I mean, any of these things we could zoom in and talk about.
Which we might do as we go along, and as
4-hour episodes podcast, they're kind of ranting away.
But as people, if anyone finds things that we mentioned that we don't talk about enough, we're happy to take recommendations.
Absolutely.
Actually, aren't we?
Yeah.
Because email us.
Call now. Yeah. The lines are open. Yeah. No, absolutely, and people will have their own areas of interest that maybe they'd like to see explored, or questions as well about certain customs. I mean, I know that in this particular episode as well, we're not really talking about largely the material itself. It's more the cultural context around which it was looked at. But
which
in
I think
future,
is necessary, just to give you a flavour of where we're coming from.
Absolutely,
so that we can focus on substantive topics then.
But the collectors had to, like you were saying, they had to travel all over the country. Now, similarly, there were areas of the country that were largely neglected. For example, the city centre, as we mentioned, for a great many years. And that's some of the bias of the collecting agency needs to be seen sometimes. Why is it that a certain tradition seems to not exist in a place? Is it because it wasn't practiced, or is it because it wasn't seen as worthwhile in collecting in that area? But collectors would travel the country, and they would, I suppose, develop close working relationships and friendships indeed with many of the informants from whom they gathered material. And there were lots of then publications that were kind of carried out and that came about through the Folklore Commission and its work, that would often focus on the repertoire of one individual and their narratives. And so Leabharlainne or Sean O'Connell's book is an example of that Largy went and collected from him in Kilrealick in Kerry, and he published Sean O'Connell's repertoire. So you'd have other versions of that, similarly like Eamon the Bork is another figure, or certainly Peg Sayers would be someone who from whom an enormous amount of material was collected.
People are cringing all over the country now and beyond. They've touched on Peg.
Poor Peg has been ruined for a great many people. I think it might have been a poor choice for his kind of school book.
Unfairly so, actually.
She is one of the most incredible storytellers, and kind of she had hundreds and hundreds of varying kind of tale types of proverbs. Anna Nicoloon and Donegal is another. Collections were made from her. I think I remember reading about Sean O'Hug, who was collecting from her in the Crucha in Donegal and in the Blue Stacks, and he had spent a number of days collecting these folk tales from her until he felt that they were kind of exhausted. And then he went into her one day, and there were some children in the kitchen, and she was telling them proverbs. And he thought, I didn't think to ask her proverbs. So he sat down and started asking her about proverbs, and she just gave forth hundreds of them. Had hundreds of these.
He called her the never ending well,
or the
never emptying well, that each day he'd go back, she'd have more.
Full up.
Full up again.
And this was reflected in the enormous amounts of material that was then compiled and sent in by then diligently compiled by these tireless folklore collectors who weren't working 9-to-5 jobs. They were always on call. If there was a wake, then you're going to go and maybe, gather information about or see what the practices are, or if somebody's up in the morning, or if they're back at night time, or you're just on all the time.
Yeah, but you're working to someone else's schedule constantly.
Exactly.
Especially at busy times of the year, harvest time, or depending on what's happening in the traditional kind of calendar in these people's lives, you're working to their clock.
That was it.
And kind of the storytelling and the kind of transmission of information kind of only happened after the working day. So they would be working until maybe 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and then having to go and do their next day's work of transcription, getting up at 9 o'clock again. Yeah, they're cycling around. I remember reading Sean McMahon, a collector, a part-time collector. He's obviously an interesting man himself, collecting in County Clare, and he's writing. He's apologising for how untidy his handwriting is, because he's writing in the dark. He's no oil for his lamp, no candles, because the emergency, so-called the Second World War, is on. So he's just at home writing kind of by moonlight in his little house, just transcribing enormous amounts of material that he's collected on his travels, and then up again the next day, cycling here, cycling there. Maybe no one's home, no telephones, in houses largely with no electricity. So this is the kind of the nature of the work. And we complain about silly things.
As we must. I'll play a brief recording from 1960 by Leo Corduff, who was the sound archivist here for a great number of years, and he's just as an example of the interviewing or kind of collecting process. And this is him. It's quite funny. He's talking to two blacksmiths. I think they're from County Mayo. Who are they? Two blacksmiths, Tom Naughton and James Burke from County Mayo. This is a recording from 1966, and the blacksmith as a craftsman was regarded as quite kind of ominous or powerful. They were the only craftsmen who could make their own tools, so there was a certain kind of reverence or something displayed for them, basically. And this is just the blacksmith and how they can curse you, basically.
Well, we used to hear one time that blacksmiths had great powers.
Right.
That the power of cursing, and I don't know, I never heard of any power of blessing. No blessing. No blessing.
No blessing, but
That's
they could do a bit of hair about right with the can.
They can't.
Oh,
If they turn the anvil on you and
yes.
redden an iron, and
Yes.
they can do you a lot of hair.
But
And
do you know
say,
how was that done?
I know how it was done.
Do you, Tom?
I do.
Yes, I know how it was done.
Well, no, if you wanted to curse me, you might before the night is out. How would you go about it?
I bet I could do it. I could turn the anvil
Yeah.
Turn it
the other way about
Upside
Yes.
down. Yes.
and redden a certain iron.
Is there a special
There's
iron?
a certain iron, and
What iron would that be?
it's the coulter of a plough.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what you have to redden that,
And
and you have to keep hammering, and your men will get warm. I'm telling you.
Yes.
Are
They say it's right, you know.
do you,
Oh, it is.
are there any words or prayers or
Well,
anything?
there might be curses for all I know.
But you never heard.
He never did it, you know.
That's the lads, they carry on. But that was, I suppose, again, you see as well, we're talking about material culture and the different groupings, that often material culture or aspects of it will link into more supernatural or magic or spiritual elements. So you have using the anvil, using a piece of a plough to curse someone.
So you've got the oral, the material, the custom.
Exactly, all mashed up together. And that's something we'll look at in the next episode as well, for to look at material on May Day and customs regarding May Day, and specifically if your butter happened to have been supernaturally stolen by a shape-changing witch.
That's
as
always
often
my
occurred.
concern on May Day.
Well, that the way to get it back was to heat this piece of the plough in the fire, and that the heat would be transferred to the perpetrator, basically. So you have some of these kind of ideas about how material culture and social folk custom often, well, all these elements, they blend together, basically. But the collectors, I suppose, that were gathering this material on behalf of the commission, were doing it in this very kind of organised and methodological way that allows us to analyse it cleanly later on. And through, from 1935 through up to 1971, there was an enormous amount of material collected, and from 1971 on, that's when it changed hands and it became part of the University College Dublin
came
here,
here, didn't it?
and which is now where we are now in the National Folklore Collection, largely kind of curating and still disseminating the material and still collecting as well. It's important to say, digitising it, putting it online, and then as well being kind of open to the public, to a range of scholars and researchers who come in, as well as then our academic department and teaching students and folklorists of the future, largely. So there's a long kind of strand or thread even from 19th century kind of European, I suppose, nationalist thinking, romantic nationalism and anti-industrialisation, anti-urbanisation and so on, through in the artistry of the 19th century and the more methodological approach that appears in the 20th century, but largely has the same kind of content as its focus, basically, and that is the traditional wisdom and heritage and lore of the native people, basically, and that's
It's the golden chain. I can't remember who called it that, whether it was Delargy or Ruben Hyde, but it's a lovely image, the golden chain that continues to us today and hopefully on into the future, isn't it?
Yes, this is
Which
it.
I suppose is a nice place to draw us to a close.
Yes.
If anyone's still listening, I've certainly enjoyed.
Oh,
I always
likewise.
learn something new chatting to you, Jonny, and I hope others have as well, and that you'll join us for the next episode, which, as Jonny said, will be on May Day traditions and customs. And in the meantime, we should say, as we said at the beginning, we'd love to hear from people, and if you
Absolutely.
had recommendations, it's very easy for us to say, oh, we'll look at this, we'll look at that, because we find so much interesting here in the archive. But if anyone did have weird and wonderful ideas, we'd love to hear them.
Absolutely.
So feel free to email us. We're at béalóidis@ucd.ie. We're also at béalóidisucd on Twitter. We're the National Folklore Collection on Facebook. We're available over the phone. Again, as I said, by post.
Fax.
By fax, if
Hot
you
air
have
balloon,
to.
all things considered.
Pigeon,
Yeah,
send the
yeah,
pigeons.
pigeon.
We'd
And
love
then
to
on
hear from you.
duchas.ie, duchas.ie, you can view what's the so far has been digitised from the National Folklore Collection, and you'll find on there the school's manuscript collection carried out in 1937 to 38, which is definitely one, if not several episodes
Podcasts,
on its own.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Hugely fascinating. So
but yeah.
duchas.ie, it's certainly one if you haven't looked at it to look it out.
We will leave with something from the archive. This is a little bit of a recording that I found just in the context of doing some research for Easter. And this is the very renowned musician, master piper, uilleann piper, Seirbhís Ennis, who worked for the Folklore Commission, collecting songs, and so we have all his material here. And this is him recording an air which was a favourite of his, called Easter Snow, which is named after, there's a ballad of the same name. And this is him. In fact, Seirbhís Ennis called the caravan he lived in before he died, he named it after this air. The recording isn't absolutely fantastic, but it's lovely playing.
What's interesting is you said it's from the field, so
yes, it's a kind of field
authentic
recording.
out there in the air.
That's it. So yeah, we'll sign off with this. Hope you enjoyed.
And we'll see you next time.
Easter Snow.